Do we wait a few more minutes, or it's still a little early?
It's a little early.
Okay, cool. All right, everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Benjamin Hodge, and I hope most of you were in Ben's talk before this, because he did a lot of prep work for DSC, which means I don't have to worry about it, which is great. I work for a company called KEMP Technologies. We do application delivery, so I'm a little bit unusual in that I don't actually manage any Microsoft systems at all. But our customers do. So usually we are load balancing something like Exchange, Skype for Business, a web application, and my team is helping our customers and our partners troubleshoot some kind of application problem. So we're very heavily involved inside Microsoft environments. We just have a sort of outsider's view of it, and we use PowerShell to do a lot of our own automation, things like that. So that's where the sort of inspiration for this came up. I really want to use DSC, but I don't manage any infrastructure. So how do I do that? And how do I help customers have better change processes around our product to make sure they don't open support tickets with us? So a lot of it is around us implementing DSC via APIs to third-party systems. And I think there is a lot of power in DSC that really comes from controlling other systems than just server infrastructure. So that's what I want to talk to you all about today. Are there any German speakers in the room? Yeah, okay, a few. I have to remember to point you to something later on as well, I think is some good follow-up. But yeah, mein Deutsch ist schlecht, yeah, so I won't try it, yeah. No, it was horrible. I just say hello, and they know I'm English, so, well, Australian, but okay. So most of today is really just demos and code. I want to more get across some concepts rather than really specific implementations, so I've just done a couple of basic examples. One is how you could control network infrastructure or security appliances in your infrastructure, even if they don't have OMI or LCM implemented. And another one is how you could implement configuration management for a SaaS platform, PaaS platform, something like that. So really, you hear people talk about infrastructure as code a lot, and that's a great concept and way to think about things, but it's really important to see DSC as configuration as code. Anything that you can configure in DSC, as long as you have an interface for it, right? And all the same benefits of configuration management in your infrastructure flow on to your applications and other systems, right? It's really about change management and configuration management. So, what do you do when you don't have OMI or LCM? You need to create a DSC proxy. So who uses the Azure DSC resource? Anybody? Few? Okay. So that doesn't run on Azure. It runs on a local system and calls the Azure API. Right? That's all it's doing. So you can create your own resources to do the same thing. So in my highly technical drawings, this is you. I spend a lot of time in airports and planes and on whiteboards, so I tend to scribble rather than... Okay, so this is a system that does have LCM or the OMI daemon installed. And then this is some other system that you want to manage, but it does have an API that you can call, that you can reference. And this little bit in the other corner, I didn't get to finish, so we will just forget about that. But there's some interesting use cases. Once you have this type of structure, the DSC author may not have any rights to this system. He may not even be able to know about the authentication on this system, and he might not even have rights on the DSC proxy system. Or you might have 4 eyes policy, something like this. This could be a HR system or a payroll system that the author is not authorized. So you need some way to separate the authentication to the end system from the DSC authoring process. But I didn't get there. maybe next year. Okay, so this is another highly technical sketch of my lab. You might have some kind of web application, again, Exchange, link, anything like that. You have a load balancer, and we want to configure this whole application stack end-to-end in our DSC configuration. So again, this is you. You are going to configure your web farm using DSC, and we're going to configure the load balancer using a proxy resource via its API. So the way I have this implemented is pretty straightforward. So here I have an example of virtual IP address, which I can use to access my application, which is just a default IIS install. Okay, so when we look at how this is implemented, I have my resource, which includes all of my virtual service configuration, as well as the configuration for IIS. So the whole stack is configured here. And this didn't work in the speakers lounge this morning, but I'm going to try it live on stage anyway, just to show there's no magic. Can someone just give me a new IP address? I don't know. Pick a number. Come on, Ravi.
42. Yeah.
42. Okay. Why not?
Always right.
Always right. All right. So let's run that. I have to remember the password. Okay, so that should have pushed out, and let's see if it is updated already. So I'm actually using the system that I'm authoring on to also be the proxy, just for simplicity. So the only DSC configuration on this box should be the configuration for the load balancer. I'm sorry, I only have a surface and it's a bit over capacity, so it's a bit slow. Okay, so unless the same thing happened as this morning, which it hasn't updated for some reason, sorry. For some reason, if I don't manually delete the checksum file, it doesn't properly recognize that anything has changed on my pool server. Let's make sure that it actually Okay, so now it is applying the new configuration, which hopefully will give us our new virtual service. Let me just make sure that I applied the correct value. Don't worry, I'm going to go into all of this code later. I just want to show you really the purpose behind it before we dig too deep. Oh. Okay, there we go. 42, perfect. And if we go back over here and refresh. Okay, there's my virtual service, and I should be able to reach my application. Okay, whew, good. I don't know what's happening with the checksum, but something odd. Okay, so I've used this as an example just because I already had half of it done for work, but really any kind of infrastructure in your environment, whether it's storage, security, network, right? Any device that has an API interface, you can write a DSC wrapper resource like this so that you can control end-to-end solutions rather than just partial infrastructure. So just to have a look at, just remember this was our sort of environment that we were looking to configure. Really, in this case, it's a pure class-based resource, and there's an existing PowerShell module to control this API. So most of your work is already done in that case. I'll show you an example where a module doesn't exist next. So when you already have all of the commandlets, all you're really creating is some, in this case, class-based resources to model the different resource objects, right? And then you're basically just setting up attributes for each class that map to the parameters of the commandlets, and then using those to call the commandlets. And sometimes you might need to run 2 or 3 commandlets to achieve an outcome, but usually if you've got get, set, this type of thing, that's all you need. And you're really just creating a wrapper or a DSC facade around those existing modules. So it's very, very easy to take any PowerShell module you have for a system and move it over to a class-based resource. Obviously with class-based resources, you do need WMF5, but to be honest, class-based resources are almost the only reason you need to move to WMF5, let alone all the other stuff. They are so much easier and better. So if you're doing DSC, you should really be pushing to get up to the latest framework. So in this case, we have a load balancer, the actual instance itself, a virtual service, and a real server, and they all have dependencies. So virtual services are dependent on the load balancer being present. Real servers are dependent on the virtual service existing, so they can be added to the pool. This is also a way, for example, to bring in extra functionality that doesn't exist in the appliance. So I could use this sort of automation to be checking for resource usage and then adding more servers and bursting my pool. Right? I could use it to add in cloud-based services. So I could get elastic load balancing like you might have on a cloud platform on premise, which this product doesn't do. Right? So by wrapping around APIs, you can even extend the functionality that you have out of the box in these kind of systems. Okay. As I mentioned, I'm not going to really go into detail about DSC resource fundamentals. Ben already did a great job on that, so hopefully most of you were in that or can watch it later. But I want to show you sort of how you map an existing module very easily to the methods, right? So this is just a little bit of pseudocode, but again, these are very simple functions. You don't really need to do a lot. So really, get is just checking what is the status of the real system in production right now, right? Test is then calling get to have some kind of true or false based on is it in the state that's required or not, and then set is called by test if it fails, and it's just calling set virtual service or set real server or whatever the module call might be. So it's very, very simple to implement, and there's fairly good documentation and blogs around this. So you can see if you already have all of those calls, mapping something like this around it is really easy. I just left in the sort of pseudocode comments to show you there's almost a one-to-one mapping, and that's about as complicated as it's going to get, right? I'm a very big advocate of having all of the functionality in a separate module, not in your DSC resource. So the DSC resources should be literally this simple, and all of the complexity should be in your module, where you can pester test it, where you can use it outside of DSC, right? And then this is just a shell or a wrapper around module commandlets. I know not everybody follows that pattern, but I really think it's easier to maintain, easier to scale, and you get a lot more capabilities, especially because you can use that module elsewhere. It's not just locked inside DSC. For example, workflows, we heard yesterday, right? There's a lot of cases for workflows. It's the same for test and get. They're very simple. And then just to show back again to an example of a configuration using the custom resource. So all of those attributes are just mapping to the requirements of the underlying commandlet. Right? So that's how you can use the module and commandlets to find out what your resource attributes should look like. Does anyone have any questions about this kind of model with infrastructure? Does anyone deal with anything except server infrastructure? Network or storage or? Yep. Okay, so great. And what about, we're going to go on to other applications. What about applications? Does anyone have to directly administrate and configure applications, or is it all infrastructure level stuff? Okay, Ravi.
Exchange, SharePoint and link deployments.
Yeah.
Automated deployments.
But given the lack of hands, maybe the wrong crowd for, hey, manage more than infrastructure. I only have to care about infrastructure. Okay, so this next one came about a little bit by accident, but it kind of worked out really well in the end. I wanted to show how you could manage infrastructure as a service platforms like Azure or AWS, but maybe that don't have DSC resources built in, because there's lots of them out there, or PaaS platforms, etc. So originally my intent was to just write a small PowerShell wrapper module for the Zendesk API, which is a common ticketing system, and kind of do the same thing. But it turns out that Zendesk just changed their API and it breaks invoke REST method, and I was too lazy to kind of deal with that. And there's already a really good Python module for it, which I knew how to use. So what I decided to do was use DSC for Linux to implement all of the requirements for DSC in Python on the Linux system, and then use DSC for Linux to control it this way. In the end, it worked out really well because most APIs are written for developers, not for ops teams, and they always have a Java port, a Python port. Very often, these are always maintained and updated, but a PowerShell module might be difficult to come by. So rather than have to implement that all from scratch yourself, and rather from having to maintain that when they change their APIs, it's very easy to take existing modules and packages in other languages and again, wrap them in DSC via DSC for Linux and get the outcome you want and the control. So I have another diagram that sort of shows the flow more clearly, but the pieces are, there's a few pieces involved. So this is a Linux system with DSC installed, and it's going to act as our proxy. So we're going to implement a DSC configuration on that system, which we'll call the API. So this is the original Zendesk Python module that is published on GitHub. I wrote my own module that implements essentially DSC classes for what I want, right? It's not official, but I've mapped that so the structure's the same. And then we use the built-in NX script resource for Linux to call that custom Python module. So again, we're just creating a wrapper around another system. So this way you can basically use NX script to make meta resources. And I think there was some other discussions about meta programming, meta configuration, and things like that. These are really important concepts to understand so you can take advantage of leveraging these kind of systems. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. And again, hopefully I didn't have any problems with the checksum for this. Okay, so here I have just a Zendesk trial, and I've created a DSC test view using DSC. So that view is managed by DSC. And obviously there's users, there's groups, there's permissions, anything you can configure, you can control via the API. So the way this has been done, I'm just going to hide the parameters so we can see more clearly. This is the NX script resource. So all it's doing is importing my other module and basically creating an object and calling a method, right? So this is just a very, very simple wrapper, and everything else is in my Python resource. So again, somebody want to give me a name? Well, hopefully. What about Ravi's view? It's always great talking about DSC when Ravi's in the room, no pressure or anything. Okay. Okay, so we're going to run this. Okay. So in this case, with Linux at the moment, I'm just pushing it. So this is just going to create them off, and then I still need to do a start DSC configuration to push that out. I have an existing sim session for that. And we just need to point it to the path. Where that's. Hang on, sorry, I need to check what I actually called. Yeah, okay. I've forgotten all my shortcuts. There we go. Okay. Okay, so that's pushed out, and let's test our configuration. This one seems to apply pretty quick, so providing my tethering is still working. Okay, so it says it's true, and let's have a look. Okay, there's Ravi's DSC for you. Woo! Demo's done. No fails. Good. Now I can relax for the rest of the talk. Okay. So I just want to show you a little bit about how this is implemented, and I do have a workshop later today about my design and coding process, and particularly because I do work in other languages. I've tried to make it really easy to have one process regardless of the language I'm implementing in, right? Which means I break some best practices in sort of every language that I do, just so they're more consistent. But it does help you because everybody's in a very heterogeneous environment. It's very, you need to deal with a lot of different systems more and more as headcounts get smaller and systems get more complex. So having something that works in multiple languages is very useful, I find. So just to show you how the sequence of this sort of flows, if you're interested in this type of control. So we have our NX script, and this is great because NX script basically is just an infinite meta resource. You can put any code in there you want. Bartek has a great blog on DSC for Linux, which is essentially the only documentation on DSC for Linux right now. And I will show a couple of gotchas that I found with doing this as well that aren't documented well, that will save a lot of time. So that will output a MOF, which we then pushed. So we have LCM, or the OMI daemon, running on our Linux DSC proxy. And that is going to call the test method of my view resource, right? So, sorry, it's going to call the test script that was defined in the NX script. That's going to call my own, this is my Python module, right, where I've defined a view resource. Okay, and the view resource has get, test, and set methods, just like a real DSC resource. This will then use the existing Zendesk API module. So somebody's already built this for me, and they maintain this, right? So we have an NX resource wrapping around a custom Python module, wrapping around a Python API module, right? So you have these layers. But this part is extremely simple. This is really just calling this, right? There's not really a good way to implement your own Linux resources at the moment. I'm hoping to find out a little bit more from the Microsoft guys how to do that, but the issue is on the authoring side. You need to be able to publish a resource on the authoring machine so that it knows how to map them off. The side on the actual node is really easy. Okay, so then this will call to the Zendesk API, which will then return, and it'll all loop back like this, right? And then if it failed, obviously it'll call set and go through and actually make the changes that are required. And then it'll loop back around, right? Obviously LCM will just keep running around and calling that. Does anyone have any questions about how those pieces fit together before we look at code? Okay. So that doesn't display well, but I will show it in a better view later. This is the Python version of the pseudocode that I did in PowerShell, right? So again, it looks very, very similar. Even if you don't know Python, you've got 3 methods, and they're doing exactly the same thing. Get is calling the API to check what is currently there. Test is checking if it matches the configuration and returning a Boolean. And set is called if test fails to implement the change. So this pattern is exactly the same in Python or PowerShell, right? You could copy and paste your pseudocode to any language. It would need to do exactly the same thing, right? So then all you need to do is implement that. So I have hopefully this will be better when I go into this a bit bigger. Can we turn off the lights at the front maybe? Dunkel is dark, right? Yeah. Nope. Okay. We don't really need to go into detail. I just want to show you how familiar these structures are. Thank you. How familiar the structures are, right? So I've defined Zendesk view, a class. So this is, again, another class-based pattern. I have all of the attributes here, okay? And then I have my set, my test, and my get methods, right? I do have some helper methods here, but really, there is no difference here at all. So even if you're not very familiar with another language, if you keep all of the complicated things in the other module, your DSC module should be really, really simple. So again, this is just calling a few methods that are self-explanatory: update, create, delete, right? Based on the current state of the system. And the same for test. Okay, so I mean, other languages like Python or Ruby are very close to English, similar with PowerShell. So there's, you know, a little bit of Googling, or what we're binging, as everybody's been trying to say. You can get a solution in place quite quickly. So there are a couple of things I found if you want to do this kind of wrappers in other languages on DSC for Linux. There was only really one thing that tripped me up, and it was in the NX script resource. So this is set and get don't matter. You can do whatever you like. But test, the problem I had was test was returning true all the time. So when I first implemented the configuration, it would apply, but if I deleted or modified something, test would always return true. There's a couple things here. Essentially, what you're doing is you're giving a string, a here string, to each of these values that will then be dynamically built into a script on the Linux side when the resource is called. By default, there's an assumption that this will be some kind of shell script, a Linux shell script. But the way Linux works, and this is all in Bartek's blog, but there's a couple of key things that he discovered. The here string is the best format for implementing this, because this shebang, this hash and exclamation, in Linux this tells the system how to run this file. So it doesn't look at extensions. File extensions don't matter. That is how it knows it's a Python file, right? So this is a way you can implement it, so the system will call whatever is in the shebang. So you can use any language here, right? But Linux needs that shebang to be the first thing in the file. There can't be any white space before it. And if you don't use a here string, you normally get a little space or character inserted by DSC when it compiles it to a file. So the here string is the safest way to do it. And then you use the formatting, the -f, to insert your parameters into the correct places, right? So these are just placeholders that will be replaced with the values in these parameters. What was not covered, because Bartek said, I'm going to do an example where test always returns true, so don't worry about the mistakes in my code. And I wanted a test that returned false, so it wasn't very useful on why it wasn't. So what I was first doing was doing return statements. Return 0, return 1, return Boolean values, just like I would in a PowerShell resource. But the way this is actually implemented, all of your return values from your test are just thrown away. So what the DSC daemon is actually looking for is what is the system exit code of the script process. So on Linux, an exit code of 0 means everything ran without errors. An exit code of 1 means there was some kind of error. So again, you have to flip the Boolean thinking. Exit 0 means the test passed. Exit 1 means the test failed, right? So everything you return, if I returned this, it's just all thrown away. You need to find whatever the language you're implementing, they all have system exit codes, right? They have a way to give an exit value. So you just need to find out what that is, and that's what your NX script test block needs to return to get the right behavior. Okay, this is just the script blocks. So one of the biggest things is, I think, to find ways to think beyond just your servers and your basic infrastructure when you're thinking about a tool like DSC. Anything you can configure, you want to control. You want to control it through configuration management like DSC. And there's lots and lots of ways to take these APIs and take these systems that are already out there and bring them into that ecosystem you have without doing a lot of extra work, and even leveraging work that has been done for developers to control these systems in other languages. There's also a really good breakout session in German. Sorry, I spoke to Jan, but it's only in German. That looks at how you structure these kind of projects and larger projects to get nice, clean code structures. Probably something more complicated is better. How you structure your projects and how you can build up these big libraries of other resources and methods that you can use together. So I think for me, being outside of the normal operations team, there's so many things that we can now use and control under DSC, or give DSC snippets and resources to customers and to third parties to really configure big end-to-end solutions in a very consistent way. And we're even looking at ways we can do operational testing against our appliance and against our systems, and change management, that when a customer comes to us with a problem, we already have a really good idea what's happening in the environment, even if they're not tracking it. So I think there's some really interesting stuff happening in the native resources, but really, if you look at everything else that's out there outside of the normal infrastructure ecosystem, there's a lot more power behind something like DSC that we haven't really looked at yet. And I think a lot of these API resources and proxy resources are going to really open up a lot of new possibilities. Everything worked really well, which means we have lots of time. I was expecting maybe some issues with the Wi-Fi. Does anyone have any questions, or even do you have any ideas of some systems you might want to control, and questions about how you might start with that? Yes?
Actually, you would put that last splash screen up so that people can tweet storm.
Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, so I'm trying to just tweet storm the hell out of my product management team. This is being recorded, so that's great. So, yeah, tweet storm for good. So we have a PowerShell module already to automate our product, but it has been sort of an aside, right? It hasn't been a big priority. That's now changing, and the module's great. I'm helping them do a lot of work on it because it was mostly built by developers who didn't really know anything about PowerShell. So it technically worked, but it stomped on namespaces and did a lot of ugly stuff, right? I spent too much time going through 197 commandlets and mapping them to approved verbs and things. But the next step that I really want us to take is to build an official DSC resource that we publish for our clients, right? And that we maintain. And again, once we have that module, it's a simple wrapper. And I think infrastructure vendors and application vendors should be allowing their systems to be put under configuration management. So I pitch this to my PM team. The CTO gets it. PM is a little bit on the fence, so I'm hoping to tip them over on my side. I'm meeting with them next week. So I don't really care if you use load balancers or care about our product, but if you want all of your vendors to provide DSC resources, and the other thing that I really want us to do is allow that DSC resource to accept community contributions. They're the two things that the two messages I really want my product management team to see how much support there is for that. So there's a couple of tweets from me last night. You can retweet, or this is me, and this goes to the corporate account. Just tweet the hell out of it. It's okay if you want to do it now while I'm talking. Just tell them you want open source resources. Tell them you want infrastructure vendors to provide those resources. And yeah, help me in my battle with PM. So sorry, does anyone have any systems or questions yet?
Yeah, a question around credentials.
Yes.
Analytics-based.
Yes.
It looks like you're passing them in plain text.
Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of things. Obviously, if it is a resource that is, let me just go back to the sort of environmental kind of overview that makes this a bit clearer. Hang on. It's right at the start. Okay. So if you are trying to pass credentials for a resource that actually lives on the system that is consuming the configuration, you use your secure credentials and certificate-based encryption of credentials in DSC like normal, right? I have that all set up, and that's working fine in the case of the PowerShell module for the load balancing system. The issue you have here is this part. So any credential I put in here, right, is not for this system. It's for this system. So if I have a module that can consume credential objects, again, I can encrypt them, no problem. But for example, in this case, in Python, if I pass it a PowerShell credential object, it has no idea what to do with that. And I don't have proper MOF mappings because I have this weird NX script is really a Python script. So I don't have ways to take advantage of that built-in intelligence of saying, oh, this is a credential object. I can encrypt this and I can pass it through parameters and things like that. If I had time to think about it more, I might find a way to use that, and I think that would be the best kind of solution, is find a way to consume that within your own pseudo scripts and wrapper scripts. But I think there is also a case, like I said, just not from a technology perspective, but the way enterprise organizations are set up. When you start extending it out beyond, there's a very good chance that whoever is authoring this, and even this system here, and this system here, they won't share any kind of credential domain, and they won't be allowed to. You'll have separation of duties, you'll have 4 eyes, you'll have all kinds of stuff getting in the way of, the author won't be allowed to know the credentials to put in the configuration. So you need to have some other method where either the proxy system itself can grab credentials securely and then bring them into your other wrapper scripts, or some other mechanism where you're separating the resource authoring process and the resource implementation from the authentication mechanism. So, and you only really start to see this when you sort of have multiple hops of systems and you get further and further away from the DSC resource to the end system that you're configuring. Actually, I haven't had time to go through that, but yes, that's an issue that comes up when you have this kind of situation that you need to find a way. I did see someone using KeyPass in one of the other talks for like a kind of poor man's store. For example, you could have a KeyPass store here, and then in your NX script function, it has some way of accessing that local KeyPass and bringing in the credentials that are then brought in as variables and consumed. You could start doing things like that. But out of the box, it's a bit of a messy problem. Yeah, I just ran out of time to cover that. Anybody else? Is anyone else using languages other than PowerShell? can I ask what languages? Python? Yeah? Okay. Great. I picked a good good example. Yes, I do a lot in Python as well. And again, every API out there has a Python port for it. So it's very easy to pick things up. And if you're familiar with PowerShell, Python shouldn't be a stretch. They have a very strong sort of mandate in the language that readability is one of the most important things in the syntax. So it's very close to English structures, and it's very easy to map PowerShell and Python. But like I said, I tend to use the verb noun naming structure in my Python functions so that it maps, because I really like that of PowerShell. And then I use camel case instead of, sort of dashes and things, but it reads very similarly.
Just don't get the braces wrong, or the indentation wrong.
Don't get the white space wrong. Then I format my PowerShell the way I would format Python. So again, I try to make one process so that it doesn't hurt my brain as much when I switch. And I tend to, again, I've got a workshop this afternoon. I tend to write a lot of stuff in pseudocode, which is just comments, and then worry about the implementation later. So I can do a design and then implement it in PowerShell, in Python, in both. And it makes it very easy to get your intent clear and structured. And yeah, I do a lot of things on planes and stuff when my battery is dead, so I tend to program without computers a fair bit. I think I want to write a lot more things around these kind of resources, that I'd really love to have a documented process for creating Linux-based resources. I think that opens up a lot of capabilities and possibilities, so hopefully that'll come soon. But yeah, definitely you can do a lot more than just manage your standard server infrastructure hosts with DSC. Okay, any other questions or anything anyone wants me to go back on or into more detail? This was more of a high level rather than really nitty gritty. The implementation is quite simple. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks everybody. Oh, and for all the German speakers, remember to go to Jan's breakout session at 1:30. It looks really good. He's done this some awesome work.